They'll blanket you in Wi-Fi and profit off the radiation. Congregation collecting the people for that Satan. I keeps it blazing, cause I can read between the lines. I ain't blind, we unwind what they're really saying. Genetically modify what you're tasting. Loan you that cottage promise, so now you live up in your mom's basement. Redesign time so your mind is always wasted. Programmed to crave the basics. Keep the beta in stasis. Pay the state, kid. You're in debt for being born. Messengers are more than just the price for being warned. Don't be alarmed, disconnect from their machinations. Stop subscribing to the folly of own nations. Bone breaking ain't the answer, cause they seek the ownership of souls. Spread the seeds and watch them grow. Break the chains of control. Break the chains of control.
Sweet eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful, friends. Rogueways is getting mystical, magical, and mythical tonight as we meet a new friend with an old tale straight from the heart of New England and draped all across time, even to this day. It is a story of witches, sea serpents, magical folk, and pirates interwoven with legends and folklore, and comes to us through the channel of an anthropologist and storyteller extraordinaire, authoring many books, Peter, I'm so sorry, I don't know how to say your last name.
Muise. Peter Muise.
Peter Muise. That's so funny because I almost called you a muse, and of course you're a muse. Well, welcome to Rogueways, Peter Muise, and how are you doing tonight?
Good. I'm excited to be here, excited to share some spooky and interesting stories with folks. So I'm ready.
I love it. I'm so excited too. And before we jump in, I'm just going to say thank you to all the listeners, all the watchers, all the people who comment and chat along with us as we are live streaming every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 7 p.m. Mountain. And everybody who supports the show in various ways, especially people on Subscribestar and on locals in our community there, or here on Rockfin, where it is the best place to be because this is where we can speak freely and be ourselves every way we want to be, every time we want to. So thank you to every single one of you for being here and for being you. And also, if you don't know already, there is a meditation group. It's a monthly subscription. And so if you want to meditate with us twice a week, you can go to rogueways.org and grab that. And I would love to see you there. It is such a nice experience for all of us, and everybody who's a part of it really loves it. So if that's something that will just boost you to the next level, or you'll just enjoy it for yourself, then you deserve it and you should go grab it right now. All right, Peter, I always ask the pointless question of the episode. And for you today, I'm asking, if you were a mythical creature or cryptid of any kind, what would you be and why?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess the thing that came to mind is I would be a centaur. I think I'd like to be a centaur, right? You just run around in the woods with your shirt off and you carry a club and you cause trouble. And yeah, I think I'd like to be a centaur. I think that's a good thing.
I love that. Are you a Sagittarius by chance?
I'm not. I'm a Pisces.
Oh, okay.
I could be like an ocean centaur, right? One of the ichthyokentoroi or something like that. You know?
I love it. Yes. I was like, I want to be a griffin because I could fly. And then I was like, wait, why wouldn't I be a dragon then? Or like Pegasus. That would be fun too.
Yeah. An angel, lots of things you could be.
Best of all worlds. Well, Peter, what was your childhood like? Were you always into the mystical, mythical, and things like that?
I pretty much was, yeah. I was one of those kids growing up who was really into mythology. I can remember when I was, I must have been like 7 or 8 or something, like having one of my grade school friends come over and we, dressed up all the Star Wars figures and the Planet of the Apes figures as Greek gods. And we made a little Mount Olympus out of a cardboard box. And everyone had a toga made out of like a paper towel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I was really into like Greek mythology and then later sort of Norse mythology and things like that. Obviously played Dungeons and Dragons since I grew up in sort of that era when it first became popular. And then even when I went on to college, I studied anthropology. And so, I managed to work in kind of like mythology, folklore into anthropology as well. And then when I was, I guess I was probably in my late 20s or so, I realized I did not know much about sort of the mythology and sort of folklore of the place I lived my whole life, which is New England, in particular Massachusetts. And so I really started to like delve into that. And the delving has never stopped because I keep finding more and more stuff. And plus at the same time, there's kind of new things bubbling up all the time, like urban legends and paranormal encounters and things like that, which I kind of group together in my mind. So it's all kind of mixed up in my mind, those things.
Yeah.
So it's been really interesting. It's been a great topic, a great hobby to have, I think.
Definitely. And it keeps your imagination alive, which I think is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves. And a lot of kids these days probably don't have the imagination that you had to do all those things when you were a kid. But it's also really fun to think about, each of us could probably, especially as we hear more of your stories and how you came about them, we could probably look in any region that we're in and start to find some similar things, because everybody tends to end up with some of these fringy, paranormally, cryptid and mythological sorts of stuff, right?
Definitely. I think, I'm lucky to live in New England because it's one of the older parts of the country. And so I have I've got like 400 years of recorded weird stories to look at. But even people in more recent parts of the country still have you might have 100 years, you might even have 50 years, but you will still have UFO sightings, Bigfoot, other cryptids, ghost stories, urban legends. Those things are every place. Wherever there are people, there are those stories. And so I feel like if you want to connect with the place that you live in a different way, that's a way to do it. Find out all the haunted houses in your county or in your town, right? Or find out where all the cryptids have been, or things like that. It's kind of a fun way to get to know the place you live in a slightly different approach, I think.
Yeah, that's so cool that you have anthropology background too, because I went reading about some of the local ghost stories where I'm at now, and it always has to come with some history, but it also always has to come with some anthropology. You have to understand the people who created this story and the time, and also what was going on, and all of these things to give it sort of more context and depth, and it just makes the story even better. So I'm sure that has only helped you in your experiences.
It has. It's it's good to know the context and understand I like stories from the Puritan era, and so it's helpful to know something about Puritan society and their approach to religion, their approach to gender, and that helps kind of illuminate the stories more. Oh, this is why female witches are riding men like horses because of X, Y, and Z, or whatever is happening in Puritan society. That comes out in these stories, their fears or their concerns about gender roles or things like that.
Yeah, especially the Puritans. They're their own horror story almost. You're wow, they're really committed to this.
I know they get a bad rap these days. They do.
Well, tell us a little bit about New England, and is it weirder than anywhere else you've been, or is it just the one you know the most about?
It's the one I know the most about, but I will say, when people ask me this question, I do like to point out that three of the most famous horror writers in the world, probably the most famous and influential horror writers in the world, all came from New England.
Is it?
So you've got Edgar Allan Poe, who was born in Boston, grew up in Boston, lived here until he was a young man. Then he just couldn't take it anymore. He's I have to get out of this uptight town, and he went south. So you've got Poe. H.P. Lovecraft grew up in Rhode Island, right? He's kind of a weird, problematic person, but famous, influential, grew up in Rhode Island. And then Stephen King grew up in Maine.
Yeah.
So the three of them all came from a really small part of the country. And why is that, right? Why would those three people in a certain genre come from one small place? And I do think New England has a weirder history maybe than some other areas. I think, when the Puritans came over, it was the early 1600s. Plymouth was founded 1620. Boston's founded 1630. Salem 1626. So it's pretty early. And there was some earlier settlements in Maine even that just didn't pick up, 1607, I think, there was a settlement in Maine that just didn't catch on. And so when you think about that time, that's the late Renaissance, pretty much. It's a very different worldview. And as I've said to people, the Puritans who came over here could have seen Shakespeare's plays performed live on stage for the very first time.
Wow.
Right? They're oh, I just saw The Tempest, and I'm getting on a boat to sail to North America, and who knows what I'm going to find.
True.
So it was a different worldview, but not that the Puritans really watched plays, but if they had watched plays, they could have seen Shakespeare.
Wow.
And so it's a more magical worldview at that time. It's a more supernatural worldview. It's a very religious worldview. And when they came over here to New England, the intent was to create a theocracy, right? They wanted to create God's kingdom on earth, a shining city on the hill, which would be a beacon to all mankind, all these things. And, they didn't quite succeed, right? They had a few bad traits, let's say. But I think looking back at that worldview, you can see that they were telling these strange stories and just telling them as if they were normal. Like if you look at the diary of Governor John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, like in 1641, he just is writing in his diary, blah, 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 blah. Oh, by the way, last week, a ship carrying a necromancer in Boston Harbor exploded because someone fired a pistol into the gunpowder and the ship exploded.
Wow.
And so he goes on to say that, a lot of people died in that explosion, and rescuers found most of the corpses, but they did not find the corpse of the necromancer, which went missing. And so then, like a week later, I think it was January 18th, 1644 it is, people in Boston see this strange light floating over Boston Harbor. Like it's kind of this glowing orb emitting sparks floating around. And then the next night it reappears and it takes the shape of a huge man. So it's like this glowing humanoid shape floating over Boston Harbor. And people hear this voice coming out of it saying like, boy, boy, come away, come away. And this goes on for like several days, like several nights, people see this thing over Boston Harbor. And, John Winthrop is kind of like, it was probably the devil coming to like find the dead necromancer and drag him, off to hell. And so that's like in the governor's diary. And then the next entry is like, oh, and, taxes, blah, 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 crops, blah, 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 building the stockade around the city, blah, blah, blah. So he just throws those things out because it was just part of their view of the world. And like John Winthrop also wrote about, I think what's considered one of the first UFO sightings in North America. So again, it's like 1640s or so, and these two men are rowing in a boat on the Muddy River, which is a river here in Boston. They're rowing, 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 and they see this light in the sky above them, and it takes different shapes. Like at one point it looks like an arrow, at one point it looks like a giant pig even floating in the air above them. Like, oh, this is really strange. But then they realize when the light disappears that they have moved against the current up the river like 4 miles.
Wow.
And they're like, wait a second, like, how did this happen? Like, we don't remember rowing. Like, how did this happen? So it's almost like an early missing time story. Yeah. Like somehow they were transported up the river against the current. And so again, that's in John Winthrop's diary. Like, oh, when this happened, now we're making a treaty with the Dutch or something. So
we're so far removed from that. We're so materialist and we're like very practical and we, have superstitions. I mean, we're supposedly, right, in our society. Right. To think of that like magical of a mindset that you could just look at that and be like, oh yeah, that happened. Like,
yeah. And I think like those stories are interesting. Then the negative side is, witchcraft trials. Yeah. Like when you take that kind of magical, mythical worldview and you impose it on the outcasts in your society, on the neighbor that you don't like, and blame them for all the problems that are happening. And then you get witch trials, basically, is what's happening there. So there's the negative side. Like it's fun to read about the giant flying pig UFO, but then it's sad when you realize, oh, like in Massachusetts, 24 people were executed for witchcraft. And then many more were also accused and,
lives ruined. And yeah, it's crazy. I always think about the ergo poisoning or ergot poisoning.
Yes.
And if that played a role, because it doesn't seem, it just seems so singular. And you're like, well, if you had this mindset this whole time, like, why is this the only time it really broke out? And I don't know if that is maybe a part of it or not, but.
So I think like there are two things. When the Puritans who settled New England came from part of England called East Anglia, which is a specific area. And East Anglia was the area where they had the biggest witch hunts and witch trials in England. So there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of fairy folklore, things like that. There was a lot of like witch folklore, devil folklore. So they came from that part of England to New England and kind of brought those beliefs with them. And, in 1641, they wrote a law like, if any man or woman be a witch that is hath a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. So that was 1641. And 1648, they executed the first woman in Massachusetts for being a witch and kind of went from there, Yeah. So like the ergot theory is interesting. I just don't know if it's quite right. I think the true explanation is just social causes and human malevolence is probably more likely.
The culture and what you're indoctrinated into, and then how easy it is, like you were saying, to blame someone else and make them the other and say like, well, now we got to kill you and everything's going to be better. The pig UFOs won't move us around on rivers anymore.
Right, exactly. It's one way to look at those old witch stories, it was like when bad things happen to people, what's the explanation, right? Like if I'm a Puritan settler, why is my child sick? Why did my livestock die? Why can't I churn my butter? Whatever the things were happening in life, like, but my neighbor can do it. But it's not. These things aren't happening for me. Someone's got to be to blame, right? Because I'm as good as anybody else here. So someone is doing this to me, and it's usually would be the person you argued with, like the week before, who often was the social outcast, right? Someone who comes to your door like, oh, can I have some eggs, right? So I was often a poor person, like, can I have some eggs? Can I have some milk? Can I have some firewood? And then you say no, like you can't spare it. And they kind of walk away like, like muttering under your breath, like, what are they muttering? What are they muttering about? And then like, the next day, maybe your cow gets sick. And the day after that, your baby gets sick. And then the day after that, I don't know, the bread doesn't rise. Like all these things happen and you think, ooh, what's causing this? That person I had the fight with, I bet they're a witch. And it would just go from there. And they were like, before the Salem witch trials, there were 83 trials involving witchcraft in New England. And, some of them were just cases of slander. Like someone might say, oh, so-and-so is a witch. And then they would get sued by the person who was accused of being a witch. And some of them were legitimate witchcraft trials where someone was accused of being a witch and had to stand on trial for that, And it was a capital crime. So it was a pretty major thing to be accused of being a witch at that time.
Man, I can't imagine these days. Like I taught middle school and I was a middle schooler at one point. And I think we would have used that against people because we were horrible.
It's interesting. Like not all the cases, but a lot of the cases did involve like young children.
Young women, right? Especially, right? Like
young women, young girls, young women in like the Salem witch trials sort of kicked that one off. There were some in Boston that were started by young girls also. And as part of it is like Puritan society was very age-based. So young people had no power. If you weren't a married person, you really had no power. And also women didn't have any power. They had less power than men. It's like a married woman had more power than an unmarried woman, but an unmarried woman, and particularly a young girl, would be like, they were the bottom of the hierarchy. And, Massachusetts in the 17th century was a stressful place. Like it was a frontier situation. There was a lot of warfare, which people don't really think about too much these days, but there were a lot of like attacks on the frontier areas in Maine and places like that, where hundreds of people were massacred by the Native American tribes who were, defending their own land. But to the Puritans, this was an attack by the devil on the colony. And so Salem had lots of refugees from Maine who had come south to seek safety in Salem. And they brought these stories of like seeing villages burned, seeing people massacred, tortured, all this stuff. So the level of anxiety in the 17th century was really high in Massachusetts, particularly in the 1690s. People were like, what is happening? Like, is everything going to go to hell here? Literally to them, Yeah. And so I think it kind of came to a head in Salem. Like it was that was the boiling point, and people were venting their anger, their fear, their frustration on somebody, and they were just venting it on each other, unfortunately,
Yeah, that's that context we're talking about, right? You can kind of understand it at that point when you're like, well, that was rough. And there, when you're saying like, these things aren't working out for me and I'm as good as anyone else, they were really, really good. They're like, I read my Bible all day, every day. My poetry is written to God and about God. And like 100% of what I do is prayer and praise. So how could things go wrong for me? If you have that worldview, it makes sense.
Yeah, right. They definitely believe the devil was working to go against them, right? Like the French in Canada were agents of the devil. The Native Americans were agents of the devil. Witches were the agents of the devil. So there were these agents of the devil out there causing trouble for you in various ways. So
I gotta say that simplistic of a worldview might be really nice to have. You're like, this good, this bad.
Right. And I will say, it's even with the Salem trials, though, there were people at the time, even at the time, were like, this is not right. A lot of ministers were opposed to it. They were like, this, you don't have the right type of evidence. The evidence you're accepting is not valid. So people were protesting, but they were sort of drowned out for most of the time until later on. People were like, oh, you were right all along. We should have listened to these other people and not the crazy people. But it was too late by that point.
Now, yeah.
Too late.
Oh. Well, I know we have some more witch things that we could go into in some modern time too, but I would love to hear about some fairy folklore first, because that's really exciting. And I think of fairies as over in Europe and not here.
Yeah, and that's true. And I think the English colonists who came here sort of felt the same way, particularly since East Anglia didn't have a lot of fairy folklore. It was like ghost, devil, witch. Those are the things they talked about. Ghosts, devil, the witch. Those are their big folklore categories. And some of them even wrote when they came here, they're like, oh, there were no fairies in New England. Like, this is not a fairy place. There were no fairies here. And you see that even like Nathaniel Hawthorne says this in the Scarlet Letter. I mean, it shows up. What they didn't pay attention to because they were, ethnocentric or xenophobic, or call it what you will. They didn't pay attention that the Native American folks who lived here had like this vast corpus of legends about like magical creatures who lived in the woods, who are often small and kind of tricky. And so you have to treat them the right way, and then they'll leave you alone, or maybe they'll help you out. And so they're sort of analogous to like the fairies you would see in Europe. They're a very similar concept. Like often they're small, hairy, shy. They hide from people. They don't want to be seen. They might lure you into the water and drown you. They have all these sort of things that are very similar to what you see in European fairy folklore as well. And they have a lot of different names. And I won't say too many of them because I'll just mispronounce them. But so that was happening while the Puritans and the English, were colonizing this area, but they just didn't pay attention to it. They weren't that curious about the Native Americans. Like, you don't find a lot of kind of like ethnographic or studies of the Native Americans until, the 19th century. So for the first 250 years, they just weren't really, that wasn't their thing. They just wanted to take over the land, basically.
The fear had to subside a little before they could get into that.
Exactly. The one example of someone who was interested was Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island. And he was not a Puritan. He actually left Massachusetts because he, again, couldn't take it. And he wrote a book called Key to the Language of the Americas, which is like it's almost like a dictionary of the Narragansett language. And so, but he has like names of deities and all this interesting stuff in there. So, so I guess circle back to fairies. So the Native Americans had like fairy beliefs as well. They didn't sort of bleed into kind of the white English speaking culture. And that really started to change in the 19th century. The poet Longfellow wrote a famous poem called, Song of Hiawatha. And there are like magical little people in that poem. And that poem is really based off Ojibwa mythology, which is from the upper Midwest of the US area. But it was a super popular poem. People loved it. This was before TV, so people like really into poetry. And he talked about these little creatures called pukwudgies. And that concept kind of caught on in New England and in Massachusetts. So people started to talk about pukwudgies here in Massachusetts as well. And that term is fun to say, right? It's easier to say than some of the sort of traditional terms, so like Makayawasug or Namakamasug, or these words which are like, ooh, that is not an easy word for an English speaker to say, versus pukwudgie is kind of like, oh, I can say pukwudgie. And so that term started to spread around in Massachusetts. And in like the 1930s, a writer named Elizabeth Renard was collecting folk stories on Cape Cod. She wrote a book called The Narrow Land, which is just folk stories from Cape Cod. So she talked to two Wampanoag men who lived in Cape Cod, and they started to tell her stories about Pukwudgies. And so they were using this Ojibwa term, which had become popular, to talk about their own legends. And she kind of popularized the term Pukwudgies. And so now you see Pukwudgie used a lot in this area. And so people do report encountering Pukwudgies even, and sort of, some people have negative experiences with Pukwudgies, right? Like, there's a place in Freetown, Massachusetts, which is down in the southeast, a place called the Freetown State Forest, which is a big state park, thousands of acres, and has a lot of spooky stories associated with it. And there's a ledge there in particular, the Assonet Ledge, where it said that the Pukwudgies will push people off. Wow. Like if you're on the top of the ledge, the Pukwudgie was just like, give you a little push and you'll fall to your death. And several people have reported seeing Pukwudgies in the Freetown State Forest. And the stories are pretty creepy. They come from a book by an author named Christopher Balzano. The book is called Dark Woods. And he just collected all these stories from the Freetown State Forest. But, you know, there's a story about a woman who's walking her dog. It's probably the 1980s or 1990s. She's walking her dog through the Freetown State Forest. And suddenly she and the dog stop, and they see sort of squatting on top of this log, like this little gray kind of humanoid who's probably naked. It's hard to tell because he's kind of hairy, and he has kind of a long, almost dog-like snout and kind of these glowing orange eyes. And he's just kind of sitting there looking at them. And the woman and her dog are like, okay. And so they kind of like get out of there, right, as you would, right? But the creepy thing is that this woman, I think her name was Joan, continues to see the Pukwudgie. Like it starts to show up outside of her house at night. She sees it like looking in the window, you know, things like that. So it only stops when she moves away. And another man in that area told a very similar story where he sees a Pukwudgie in the woods, and then it starts to show up again outside his house at night. Like he goes out to turn on his car, right? Turns on the headlights, and suddenly in the headlights is the Pukwudgie, like in the driveway. He's like, oh, crap. Like, what is this? I don't need this. And again, like it only stops when he moves away. So they're sort of tied to a location, but have an interest in people who kind of catch a glimpse of them. And so those are sort of the spooky side. I have had a couple people tell me they've had more positive experiences with them. Particularly, there was a woman who wrote to me who was of Native American descent, and her family lived in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a very dense urban city in Massachusetts. It's an industrial town. But she would go visit her grandparents who lived in Lawrence. And she remembers one day sitting on the couch watching TV, and she felt somebody pull her hair. She looked around and like there was nobody behind her. And then she felt it again. And so she looked, there's nobody there. And the third time she turns really quickly and she sees this little old woman who's like 3 feet tall with long hair down to her feet behind the couch, like pulling on her hair. And the girl is freaked out and screamed. And the grandmother's like, you know, what are you screaming about? And the girl was like, oh, there was a little old lady with long gray hair pulling my hair. And the grandmother's like, no, that's not true. Nothing like that is in the house. And the girl and her cousin and her cousins start to recollect things like how the grandparents always leave dishes of food around the house, although they don't have pets, and things like this. And they think, oh, maybe there really are things living in this house with my grandparents. And this is confirmed one day when the girl and her cousin like go to the movies, and they come home to the grandparents' house, and they're knocking the door so the grandparents will let them in, but the grandparents' car isn't there. So like, okay, nobody's home. Because they look in through the window, they can see like this little old lady who's 3 feet tall with long gray hair, and a little old man with long gray hair, like scuttling around in the house. And so they realize that their grandparents have these sort of spirit beings, these little fairies, these Pukwudgies who live in the house with them and kind of watch over them. They don't do anything evil, like they're not malevolent, they're just kind of there.
Wow. It makes me wonder if the people who they kind of followed and popped up and appeared to are, maybe their ancestors fed them or housed them or were nice to them, and they're like, hey, this is kind of your responsibility. I'm going to
Right,
follow you
exactly. Could you just
around.
leave a dish of food
Yeah.
out for me or something? It's hard, right? It could be. And I think sometimes, like again, back to cultural context. Your cultural context defines how you will react to these things. Like, people these days see Bigfoot, right? You go out in the woods, you see a large, hairy humanoid, and some people think, oh, this is a giant ape that has somehow evaded our knowledge for hundreds of years. We need to capture it and kill it and put it in a museum or put it in a zoo, right? Like it's an animal. But then I think if you were like, if this was ancient Greece or some other time and you saw this thing in the woods, you'd be like, oh, it's like some sort of woodland spirit, right? This is like a satyr or a centaur or whatever it is, or just a wild man. And it's a spirit. It's a spirit of the forest. It's a spirit of the woods. And how do you treat it, right? How do you develop a relationship with it? And you do see even now some people who try to treat Sasquatch or Bigfoot that way. And I think sometimes people think they're crazy, right? Like people have like psychic communications with their Bigfoot, or they do leave food out for Bigfoot. And people are like, what are you doing? No, it's an ape. It's a dangerous ape. And other people are like, no, it's a spiritual being or something like that. So I think your context defines how you react to these things, whatever they are. Like, I don't know if they're real or not, but like people have the experiences always. And then how do you interpret the experience, I guess?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me too. And it makes me almost wonder too, as I've wondered before, if there actually isn't a million kinds of things. There just is a thing. And like, depending on how you perceive it, like that's kind of how it presents itself. It's like, oh, Pakwuji, I'll be a Pakwuji. Or like, oh, Bigfoot, I'll be a Bigfoot.
Right, exactly. And often it just sort of seems like they just want, it's like almost acknowledgement or something, right? They're like, they're looking in the window. They're like, these monsters look in the window so much. Like that's what they do, right? These things, there's like this image almost of like, I'm in my cozy little civilized home watching TV, playing on the internet, whatever. But outside the window is like this vast, like unknown, and it's going to look in the window. Yes. Right? It's going to like stick its face up like, rah, and you're like, crap, I don't know everything. Like there is something out there unknown to me, and it's a little freaky to finally encounter it, And
maybe it's a little good, because maybe we spend a little too much time on our couch watching TV, and it's like, hey, there's a whole universe out here.
Right. There's a creepy story from Cape Cod from the 1970s, and I found this on a Bigfoot, like the Bigfoot Research Organization website, which is a great place to go. And it's from the 1970s, and this 11-year-old boy is at home on Cape Cod. It's like a December Saturday. His parents are off doing errands, and he's just home watching TV. So he's sitting in the living room watching TV, and it's a snowy day outside. And this is important. Above the TV is a window. So he's sitting there watching TV, whatever he's watching, Saturday morning cartoons or a horror movie, whatever is on at that time in the 70s. He's just watching TV. And at one point he looks up and he sees, looking in the window, like this hairy kind of monstrous face looking in the window. And so the 11-year-old boy screams like, ah! And then the creature that's looking in the window screams, ah! and runs off. And so the boy calls his friends. He's like, are you playing a joke on me? Did you like put on a Halloween mask? And his friend's like, no, we're all at home. You can tell we're at home because you're calling us. Yeah. Like we are not anywhere near your house. And so the 11-year-old boy says, well, come on over here because something really scary happened. So his friends come over and they all get up their courage to go out to look in the backyard to see what's out there. And the backyard's it's like the backyard, then there's a woods behind that, like a forest. And so the boys all go out in the backyard to see what they can see. And they see, leading from the house off into the woods, footprints, but they're cloven hooves. So it's like these cloven hoof footprints going off into the woods. So
that's more associated with like devils and
yeah, right? It's a freaky little twist, isn't it? So you expect like Oh, and it's 14-inch monstrous. No, it's cloven hooves.
That's weird.
I'm like, okay, that's weird.
Yeah.
That kind of brings up like older imagery or something like that. Like these older themes are resurgent there somehow, you know.
Which maybe 11-year-old kid of that time wouldn't even necessarily, you know.
Yeah.
Things weren't as saturated as they are now. It was a little bit harder to find out any given thing.
It was. Yeah.
Wow. Well, speaking of the little bit scarier side of things, what are some of the creepiest haunted sites that you have been to and investigated?
Oh boy. I will just say to everybody that I usually just go out during the daytime.
That's
like
safe,
I'm not one of these people who's like, oh, I'm going to the haunted cemetery at night. I'm like, no. Like I'm usually a pretty skeptical person, but I will say, like, if you put me into the woods at night, I would become like a true believer in like 10 seconds. Like, I heard a noise, it must be Bigfoot. Right. The creepy places we've been, I would say, like, we have been to the Freetown State Forest because we want to go see the Sonnet Ledge,
but not stand too close, just
in case. And like, we parked in one of the parking lots, and the trail going into the woods was surrounded by all these dead pine trees, like a pine borer infestation or something had happened. So all the pine trees are dead. So walking down the trail through all these dead trees, and in the distance we can hear gunfire because there's like a firing range or something nearby. So immediately, like, I'm not in a calm, relaxed space, right? To hear gunfire and all these dead trees. And as we walked through the woods, like all the tree branches, it was early March, so the leaves weren't out yet. And all the tree branches are blowing in the wind and they're squeaking against each other. It's like, I'm like, okay, this is unsettling. And the landscape there was unusual because the trails are all very sunken deep into the ground. Like the trails are like a foot or so sunken into the earth. I'm not sure what sort of erosion it is, but all the trails are like you're in a trough.
Weird.
So you're kind of in these troughs. It's hard to get out of the troughs as you walk. You can't just like, you have to like climb out of them. Weird noises. And then we walked for like 45 minutes, don't see any other people. And then we see a group of people up ahead. We're like, oh, great. Yay, some people. It was like 4 or 5 teenagers, all like high out of their minds.
I was going to say, they were really high.
I'm like, oh, and I don't even know what they're on, but it wasn't just like happy pot high. It was like, I don't know what this high is, but I think we should not be near you.
Yeah.
And so like my anxiety is getting higher and higher and higher. And finally we reach the Sonnet Ledge. There's like a lake, and then there's this big stone cliff next to the lake, and that's the Sonnet Ledge. And so we go around up to the top of the ledge, and there's like a group of school children having a picnic up there, basically laughing. They had their teacher with them. Like, oh, like all the anxiety just disappeared. Like it's all gone from that one, you know?
Yeah.
But we have gone places where suddenly you don't get that release of the anxiety. We went to a place in Foster, Rhode Island called the Ramtail Mill Complex. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
It was a colonial village that was established along the banks of this river, and they built it by the banks of the river because they built a mill. So a mill that would like, I think it would process cloth. So it was powered by the river, this mill. And the mill was managed by a guy named Peleg Walker, P-E-L-E-G, Peleg Walker. And he managed the mill, but he didn't own the mill. He just managed the mill. And he, according to the legend, like he was in love with the mill owner's daughter. And so one day he said to the mill owner, like, oh, you know, I've been a really good employee. I manage the mill really well. I'm in love with your daughter. Can I marry her? And the mill owner's like, no way. Like, I'm rich. I own a mill. You work for me. My daughter's going to marry someone better than you. And so Peleg Walker is really upset, and he rushes off, you know, into the night, into the darkness. And so the next morning, people in the village hear the bell ring, and the bell is in the mill building, and that's what summons you to go to work. So they wake up, they hear the bell, and they all go into the mill building. And they're horrified to see that Peleg Walker has hanged himself using the rope that's attached to the bell.
Oh, no.
And that's why the bell is ringing, because he has hanged himself. And like, ooh, this is bad. And the mill owner comes, he just cuts down the body. He's like, okay, nothing to see here. Everybody go back to work. Like, we got to make some money here.
Wow.
And so everyone works that day. The next morning, again, the bell rings. Everyone gets up. They go into the mill, and they can see that the bell is ringing. The rope is there, but there's nobody pulling the rope. It's just kind of moving on their own. And then people are a little like, oh, this is kind of spooky. The mill owner's like, it's probably just the wind. Like, don't pay any attention to it. But just in case, he cuts down the rope. Right, okay, so to try to solve the problem. But then the next morning, again, the bell rings, people go in, there's no rope, and the bell is just ringing on its own, and people are like, okay, we quit.
Yeah.
Like, this is spooky. Clearly, this place is haunted by Peleg Walker's ghost. And so people then start to see his ghost at night wandering through the building, carrying a lantern. And they can see the light of him, like, doing his nightly rounds, although he's been dead for weeks at this point. And so people just flee. They leave the village, they abandon it, and it just falls into ruin. And you can go there and see this abandoned village. And it's just in the woods by the river, and there's like big foundation stones, there were stone walls, there were still roads and things there, and it's just like totally empty. Wow. And it was spooky. Like, it's a spooky place to be, I think. When we went, we only saw like 2 other people for like 2 hours in this abandoned village. And like, one of the weirder things that has happened to me is I took photos there using an iPhone, and a lot of them didn't come out. They just came out purely white.
Weird.
Which is weird.
Yeah.
Like, it's an iPhone. Like, how can a photo not come out?
It's not that type of photo. Yeah.
And I was taking photos of things on the ground or of walls, and it was like, no, it's just going to come out white. I was like, okay.
Because a lot of times you hear that in like Bigfoot, alien, and ghost encounters, right? That they can just, nope, we don't want to be photographed, or we don't want you to have any photographs, so we're just going to erase this. Yeah,
whatever was happening, like, I was not getting any photos. And it could just be a technical glitch, right? But in that situation, the timing, I was like, oh, this seems significant and spooky. So that only happened to me one other time, briefly, when we went to a cemetery here called the Spider Gate Cemetery in Leominster, Massachusetts, which is another kind of haunted place.
That's a name for a haunted place, like Spider.
I know, isn't it? It's really called like the Leominster Friends Cemetery or something like that. It's like a Quaker cemetery out in the woods, but it has these gates that look like an elaborate spider web. So it's known as the Spider Gates Cemetery to people. And so again, it's supposed to be haunted. And it wasn't as creepy to me as the Ramtail Mill complex, but it's still, a lot of people have encountered, spooky activities there and things like that. So,
well, with the mill, I mean, for them to abandon it and just leave, that it must have been pretty spooky to them too, like pretty nefarious feeling, or else you'd just be like, yeah, there's a ghost, but we still live here.
We don't care. We just got to keep working. Right? They're like, no, we're done. We're
out of here. That's intense. Well, let's talk about some more modern witch legends, if you want to get into some. Maybe the Albino Road.
Oh, sure. And that's from North Andover, Massachusetts, just pretty close to where I grew up. And it's a dirt road in kind of this suburban sort of country wooded area. It's a dirt road that just goes down into the woods, basically. And it's got a big warning, do not enter gate across it. Like, do not enter this road. And the legend there, people say they see these sort of ghostly figures there at night, these 2 pale figures with glowing red eyes who are quite malevolent, and they don't want anybody to go down that road. So of course people go to the road, right, just to try to see them, right? But they say that it's haunted by these 2 pale figures with these glowing red eyes who are quite angry and unhappy when visitors come there. And so the legend is that in the 1600s, a Puritan couple settled in that area and had a farm. And they had 2 sons. Like, the woman gave birth to twin sons who were albino. So they're very pale, right? Pale eyes, pale hair, pale skin. And so their parents were like, oh, our sons don't look like other people's sons. This is an intolerant society we're living in. We should hide them, right? We don't want people to see them and judge them. And so they told, as the boys they always kept their children hidden And then as the boys got older, their parents were like, whatever you do, don't leave the house when we're not around, because we don't want people to see you, because they might think you're a demon or a devil or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the boys were like, okay, sure, we won't do this. You can see where this story's going. The parents one day are off into going to town or whatever to do something, and the boys are there alone, and a neighbor comes over and catches a glimpse of these two pale teenage boys in the yard of the house. He's freaked out. He goes into the village, tells the minister and the magistrate's like, I've seen something really freaky and disturbing. We have to go capture them. And so the magistrates go and arrest these boys and put chains on them and think, we think you're demons, right? We think you're some sort of demonic supernatural entity or something like that. So they devise a test. Like the boys like, no, we're just teenage boys, right? Just teenage boys. And the Puritans like, no, we think you might be demons. And so here's the test that we'll do for you. We're going to throw you into that nearby pond. And if you, I'm trying to think because they got it reversed here. If you, hold on. Now see, I'm stumped. If you sink,
because it never made sense to begin with.
It never made sense to begin with.
Yeah.
If you sink, this means that you're a demon, and if this floats, means you're a human. Is what they tell the boys. And so they throw the boys in the pond.
And
they have chains on them.
Swam before, probably.
They never swam before. They have chains on them. Of course, they sink, and they die. And so the Puritans then go and burn down the farm and drive the parents out of town. And so, according to the legend, that road is now haunted by the ghosts of these two teenage boys who are, of course, pissed off about all of this, right? There's no there's no evidence the story's true. So I'm not sure when it first showed up. But there's no evidence that it's true. Like there's no records of the Puritans murdering two albino teenage boys or anything like that. And that sort of test of like, if they sink, they're demons, that's actually the opposite of what it usually is. Usually it's if you float, that meant you were a witch because it meant that the water was rejecting you. And like water is cleansing, water is used in baptism. So the water's like, no, we don't want the witch in here, get out. But in this version, it's reversed a little bit. So
funny. This just reminds me of Monty Python and,
yeah,
so wise in the ways of science they are.
Yeah, exactly. And there are others. There's a road in Billerica, which is sort of close to North Andover, I guess, called Dudley Road. And it's often said to be like, oh, this is one of the most haunted roads in Massachusetts. And the story there is that in the 19th century, a group of nuns were living in a convent, and there is still a convent in that area. Some nuns were living in the convent, and they kind of got bored with traditional Catholicism and worshiping God. So they kind of slipped over to the dark side, right, and became Satan worshipers.
Just a little bit bored.
It's so easy, like it's just a few steps and there you are. So they became Satan worshipers, and they would gather at night in this abandoned house, and they would, chant and praise Satan, and who knows what else they were doing, like spooky things. This went on for a while, and the neighbors finally started to hear like this chanting, the Hail Satans or whatever was happening from this abandoned house. And so the neighbors came together and hanged these nuns. They grabbed them and they hanged them from a tree, kind of mob justice or vigilante violence. And so since that time, the road is supposedly haunted by these undead devil worshipping nuns. So people say they've seen them hanging from the trees, they've seen them on the road. The abandoned house is said to be sinking into the ground. And there's this strange building on the road, which looks like it is sinking into the ground. It's very low roof line, like the roof almost touches the ground itself. So I can see why people think it's sinking into the ground. It may just have been built that way. Like I think it's a storage building, but part of the legend now is that the building is sinking from the weight of the evil that happened in it. And so this is a road where lots of people go to try to catch glimpses of these ghosts and go see the house sinking into the ground. People who live on the road are not so happy about its reputation of being a haunted. They're like enough with the carloads of teenagers at night trying to see these demonic nuns. And the road is really nice. Like it's a really posh neighborhood, like people are racing horses and it's like big old houses, but it has this reputation for being kind of spooky and haunted. So that's like another kind of modern witch type of legend from this area. And similar, like the hanging, you know, the violence, the devil, like it all is mixed in there in a different way.
This one's a bit different, though. I mean, to go from, if there's truth to it, and they really went from Catholicism to Satan worshiping, like, that is a pretty big jump. Like, that's just strange.
It's a pretty big jump, and it's no, again, there's no evidence of that one happening, but it's a good story, I think.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it is interesting that things don't really seem to change much. Like, we have the same components to our modern sort of ghost stories and legends and stuff, don't we?
We do. And there's a really interesting one also from the Freetown State Forest, which keeps coming up. And again, I'll plug the book Dark Forest by Christopher Balzano, which is a great book. But he interviewed a guy named Dave who grew up next to the Freetown State Forest. And when Dave was a boy, he and his friends would play in the woods. It's a group of all boys, which is significant as the story goes on. All these boys are playing in the woods. And they're playing in the woods one day and they hear a woman laughing at them. And they can't see anybody. Like they just hear a woman's laughter. And they think maybe they can see the outline of a woman, but it's almost like the light is refracting away from her, as if there's some sort of like shield or something sending the light away. So they can vaguely see the outline of a woman and she's laughing. So naturally they are disturbed by this and they all run home. And the laughter shows up other times. They go in the woods, they hear laughter other times. But what happens next is the kind of more disturbing part is one night Dave, the sort of the main person in the story, has a dream that he's an adult man and he's living in the woods with a woman. And they're adults. And in the dream, he thinks his wife is an adulteress. And he also thinks that she's a witch. And so he kills her, which is kind of awful. And he's like 10 years old when he has this dream. So who has a dream like that when you're 10 years old? Yeah. So he has this terrifying dream about killing his witch wife because she's an adulteress. And he wakes up and he's like, ooh, that was really freaky. The next day he goes and talks to his friends, and his friends like, oh, we haven't had that dream, but here's the dream we have. Several of his friends had a dream that at night, an older woman with long gray hair, who looks like the woman from Dave's dream, is trying to get into their bedroom window. Like she's outside the bedroom window knocking, like, hey, can you open the window and let me in? And the boy's like, no. Like even in the dreams, like, we're not going to let you in. This is a little too disturbing for us.
Good job, guys.
Except a few weeks later, one of them does, in his dream, open the window and let her in. And so he's asleep. He opens the window, I guess just in his dream. But his parents, who are down the hall watching TV, hear him screaming. And so they come running down and they can see him struggling in bed as if there's like an invisible entity in the bed with him, like fighting with him and wrestling with him and, assaulting him. And like they turn on the light and the boy just tells them, like, I opened the window, the woman came in, she attacked me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they move away. I guess it's a recurring theme. Like you live near the Freetown Forest, something creepy happens, you move away.
Yeah.
And so Dave and his friends who still stay in the area continue to see this woman in their dreams for years, trying to get in the window of their bedrooms and things like that. And they also sometimes see in the woods like a large black cat that sometimes walks on two legs, which is a little freaky. But I think, I tell this story because we were talking about how like old themes show up in new forms. Yeah. And so these are old themes. Like if you go to the Puritan witch stories, often it was like, after you blame your neighbor for being a witch, then sometimes at night, like the witch shows up in your bedroom and tries to smother you or tortures you, right? Or pokes you or stabs you or chokes you or things like this. And maybe it was just like sleep paralysis or something that they interpret as being a witch. But it's the same theme showing up with Dave and his friends, like a witch trying to get in your bedroom at night to torment you, a black cat, all this sort of stuff. And sort of also this fear of women's gender and sexuality, I think, comes into it as well,
Yeah.
So
they're so powerful. You must
fear
powerful.
Us. You will fear them. You will fear them. I do want to say, when I talk about witches also, I'm not talking about like modern contemporary witches. I'm not talking about,
Yeah.
Wiccans or people who follow the wheel of the year or honor the seasonal changes or things like that. I'm talking about like the traditional old school witch definition, which is like someone who uses magic to hurt another person. I'm not talking about like the nice person who reads your tarot cards.
Right.
Like, I'm not talking about that person.
Yeah, no, it is important. And that's another one of those things that it's like cultural and it's determined by your sort of lens. And we have a very different view of witches these days. Well, most of us, I should say. I'm sure there's many people who still view them as evil, awful people.
The definition, it's a word with a few different definitions, and the definition keeps changing, I think, It's a powerful word for people.
True. Yeah. Good point. Good distinction. Well, do you want to tell us a final story about the Melon Heads of Connecticut before I ask you to share about your books?
Sure. So the Melon Heads of Connecticut, they're only found in Connecticut and certain parts of the Midwest, which is odd. Like, they're not found anywhere else in the country. So I don't know how the legends went from Connecticut to the Midwest or vice versa.
Yeah.
But basically, Melon Heads are these little humanoids. They're kind of small and spindly. They have really big heads, like large heads, hence the term a melon head. And often they're said to have like orange eyes. And so they lurk in the woods, supposedly. That's how the story goes. They lurk in the woods in certain parts of rural Connecticut. And, like, let's say your dog goes missing in the woods and never comes back. Well, probably the melon head got them, right? The melon heads got them. Or a cat goes missing, whatever. But then some people say, if a hiker goes missing or a child goes missing, well, maybe the melon heads got that person too. And so they are these creepy little beings who lurk out in the woods. And there's a great story from, I want to say it's from 1981 or something like that, where a group of high school girls want to go find some melon heads. Like, they've heard these stories, they want to go find some melon heads. So one of them borrows her parents' car, it's like a big 1980s sedan, and these 5 high school girls drive out into the woods down the dirt road to try to find the melon heads. And so they park the car and they get out and they have flashlights. And they're like walking down the dirt road, shining lights into the trees, like, hey, melon heads, melon heads, melon heads, come out, melon heads, melon heads, melon heads. And the car is behind them at this point. They walked away from the car, just kind of trying to find the melon heads. And suddenly they hear the car engine start up behind them and the headlights come on. And the girls turn around, they're like, and they can see, like, peering above the wheel is like this big oversized head with these orange eyes, like these little hands holding the wheel. And the car like revs up and speeds towards them.
No.
And the girls like jump out of the road, like they jump into the trees to get away from the car, and the car just goes down the road and disappears. And the car like never comes back.
What?
So people say that this car, driven by melon heads, sometimes can still be seen like driving down these quiet roads in Connecticut at night, like, and it's full of melon heads now, just like cackling wildly. And so like you should avoid that car if you can. Like,
oh my god,
you don't want to see that car full of melon heads.
Because if I was a melon head and they were doing that, I'd be like, oh, okay, I'll show you.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to steal your car.
Yeah. And then if I'm interdimensional, I'll just take this all through time and space with me. Bye.
And there are a couple different stories like where the melon heads come from. In one story, they are the descendants of this Puritan family who lived in Connecticut, and they were suspected of being witches. And rather than being executed, their fellow Puritans said, we are exiling you. We're like kicking you out of the settlement. Get out. And so this family is thrown out of the settlement and they go live in the woods. And through basically incest and inbreeding and like a weird diet of like tree bark and wild animals, whatever, they kind of degenerate, they devolve into melon heads. Mm-hmm. And so that's one story of how these melon heads came to be. And then the other one, they are the descendants of inmates from a local insane asylum that was shut down. And so, you know, they were deinstitutionalized, they had nowhere to go, and they went into the woods and they kind of, again, devolved and became melon heads. And so those are the two stories. I don't know if melon heads are real, like probably not real. Yeah. But again, like if I went to those woods at night, maybe I would be a little more nervous than I am here in my apartment.
Right. Well, and they sound a little bit like they could look similar to what some people describe some ETs looking like too. So that makes me wonder.
Yeah, there's this thing like, why do so many creatures look the same?
Yeah.
Right? Why there's so many little creatures with big heads? Like some of the fairy type beings also like have that same description. So like ETs, fairies, melon heads, like how can they all be similar, but somehow they are.
Right.
Like it's almost the reverse of like the theory of neoteny, right? This idea that cute little baby things are cute, right?
Those things aren't cute.
But this is the opposite. Like these are cute little baby things that are creepy. Like somehow it's gone wrong and they're creepy.
You may be the only other person I've ever met who knows the word neoteny. So
I learned it somewhere, some psych class or whatever. Like, you know.
That's funny. Well, tell us about, excuse me, your books, if you would. I know you have many. You have like 5, right?
I don't have that many. I have 2 fully of my own that I have books chapters. So, but I'll hold up my new book. This is my current book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts, which just came out on September 1st. Available wherever you buy books online and probably some physical bookstores as well. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Bookshop, wherever. So that's just like 70 different witch stories from Massachusetts. So if you like a witch story, like this is the book for you. And it was funny, I love witch stories. And as I was researching them, I kept thinking, oh, I wish there was a book that had all the local witch stories in one place, and there wasn't. So I kind of said, okay, I'm just gonna write the book I want myself. So that's kind of what this is. And it has a big section also on the Salem witch trials also. So that's
the best way to write a book, is when you want it to exist and it doesn't exist. You're like, okay, I'll make it exist.
I will make this book exist. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're, with, again, that anthropology and that sort of grounded side of it and your imagination and, all of these things pulling together. I'm sure that's a fascinating book to read and a really fun book to read.
I try to tell the stories in an entertaining way, and then try to add just a little bit of context also. So you're like, understand maybe where the story comes from and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, perfect mix. I really love that. So Witches and Warlocks of, say it again.
Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts.
And I have the link below to your website. Do you link to those on your site for people?
I do, yeah. That's my blog, newenglandfolklore.blogspot.com. And I've been blogging there for over 13 years, which is a long time. Like, I feel like it's an ancient and, in horror movies, when someone finds the ancient book that's like bound in human skin, like that's what my blog is like, because it's 13 years old, which is really ancient for a blog these days.
Yeah, it really is. But that also makes it probably one of the coolest blogs that exists, because most of them are not kept up anymore or they've disappeared.
Yeah, I still update it a couple times. I try to do 3 times a month. Like just this week I updated it. There was a story from a vampire in Plymouth, Massachusetts from 1807. And I thought, this is a good story because we're moving into Thanksgiving and people think about Plymouth and the Pilgrims, like, let's talk about a Plymouth vampire.
Yeah.
And so it was, New England vampires were a little different than kind of like the blood-sucking vampire. It was believed that that they would kill their victims through tuberculosis, basically.
Wow.
So it was a way to explain why people in a family would all die from tuberculosis. So let's say like you're in a family of like 6 and somebody dies from tuberculosis first, and then somebody else dies from tuberculosis, and then somebody else. People would say, oh, that first person who died is feeding on other members of their family from their grave. That's what's happening here. That's why they're all getting this disease, because that person who died is feeding on them. And so the treatment was to dig up the alleged vampire. And in the gentlest form of treatment, you would just turn them over face down. So the corpse is now facing the earth rather than facing up. But then in some other more extreme cases, they would actually cut out the lungs and the liver, burn them, and then the people who were sick were supposed to eat them or drink them.
Oh God, that's the worst.
Crazy. And this is like historically shown. There's a folklorist named Michael Bell of Rhode Island. He was like the state folklorist of Rhode Island. He found 18 cases of this over a time span of about 150 years from different parts of New England.
Can
So
you
sometimes it was
imagine?
newspaper stories and things like that. Yeah.
Can you imagine being the skeptic in the family at that point? You're like,
Yeah.
can I not
Uh,
eat that? Like, I'm good.
and it's funny, this story from 1807 in Plymouth first appeared in a newspaper. And the person who wrote the article was like, you won't believe how backwards and superstitious these people are in Plymouth. Like, they think they were vampires, blah, 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 blah. And so a local doctor from Plymouth wrote a rebuttal. He's like, we are not that superstitious. There's only been one case of this in my whole time in Plymouth. So kind of acknowledging that people are doing it, but only once. Like, just happened once,
Oh,
you know.
wow. Yeah, that's
So.
also really sad to think of your deceased family that way. You're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
they're all killing us. This isn't a happy, remembrance. Oh, that's sad.
No. And it really stopped once they discovered the tuberculosis bacteria and said, no, this is what causes tuberculosis. And they started to develop treatments. And so then that belief just stopped. Like, I think the last case was 1892 or something like that. And I think they had discovered the tuberculosis bacteria in like 1890. So they kind of
they started to wean
progress.
themselves off
There
of
was
it. Yeah.
progress. Yeah.
Good job, humans.
Yes.
Well, has anything creepy or weird or paranormal or unexplained ever happened to you?
I mean, the things we talked about, like in the Ramtail Mill. I guess the only other thing I could really share is that when I was a kid, I was probably like 5 or 6. I was pretty young. I was playing in the backyard with my brother and our friend Wayne, who lived like behind us, the house behind us. And it was nighttime. So I don't know if it must have been like the fall or something like that, because we were out in the back and it was dark. And we see this big light come down in the sky, and it kind of goes down a hill near us. And we were just terrified. Like, we all thought it was a UFO. And we ran in the house screaming, and like Wayne would not go home until his parents came back from church. Like, it was like a big thing. So that's kind of burned into my mind.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was UFO, it could have been a helicopter, it could have been lots of things, but just like that feeling of like, I was amazed and I was terrified. And that feeling is stuck with me, like, oh my God, this is really happening. Like, we are really seeing a UFO, you know? So
that makes sense how you then continued on that path and kept looking for those mysterious moments of, it is fun to be full of imagination and wonder and mystery, and then also a little bit terrified maybe too. It's a good mix, actually.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you've shared your book and your site. Is there anything else you want to share for people to know about you, or how to contact you, or anything else like that you think that?
The best way is through my blog. There's an email address on the blog if people want to contact me, and that's, has a lot of stories on there. So it's got, 13 years worth of content. And of course, the book is great as well.
Yes.
So.
And click right below you, whether you're listening, watching live, or later. The link is there, and you can hop over and buy that book, Witches and Warlocks of Massachusetts. Did I get it right?
You got it right.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
I'm real bad with names sometimes, so that's good. Well, as you say goodnight to everybody tonight, is there any final thoughts or words or ideas that you want to leave people with to put a little cherry on top?
I think the idea I would leave is just that people will always have weird experiences. People have always had weird experiences. I'm sure if people are around 10,000 years from now, they will continue to have weird experiences. And it just sort of, I think the interesting thing is, how do you explain those weird experiences? Now, those explanations are what is always changing and different, I think.
I love that. That's absolutely true. And it is something that we can all relate with and connect to. And fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. And this has been your analog, electric, concentric dose of wisdom, according to the mystery-loving Peter Muise. Peter, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and your book tonight.
You're welcome.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, caterwauling through history are a million ghosties and goblins to tickle your imagination, all of them carrying their own twist, legend, and lesson. Your experience depends on your willingness to travel down those twisty pathways into the past and into the liminal spaces between waking and dreaming, between past and present, and between humanity and what lies beyond. There's always more to explore, depending on whether you want to open that door. You're always the master of your own doorways, and until you've opened and closed all the portals you want in exactly the balance that makes you happiest, travel well aim for balance, and always look inside first.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I know all around the world, shit. No one even heard of me halfway around the block. I just got an SOS from somebody's girl, begging for a photograph of my watch. Most don't know what time it is. I don't know whose mind this is. Snowing in my sinuses, the league is gonna find the kid. Administer punishment. Underwater drumming squids, fuckers wanna pummel and toss them in the rubble bin. What a dumpster fire. Motherfucking why? Tried to fuse it in. If your thoughts are living, grow tired. Split the venom mouthpiece in your mental housing. Sent to finish bounties on everyone who's doubting. There you have it, folks. There's the first round. Contestants know what they won. This insanity. God damn it, Chuck. Said tell them what they won. Took a little breather while we took a break. Went to a park and stole a rich kid's cake. Staking marijuana too, bumping some Nevada tunes. Washing down the clown with some of Svetlana's brew. Who the fuck are you? That's what they keep asking. Kevin Garvey on a beat, international assassin. Smashing like my life's at risk. Caskets for the brightest spit. Rip mics till arthritis hits. Still might make a life of this. Never will concede my run. Clever with deleted funds. Ever undefeated punk professor of the beaten drum. Well, goddamn, that was embarrassing.